Hello there, viewers. We are sitting in Vienna right now. We are going to talk with the political scientist Ivan Krastevvel. We are going to touch issues such as the Eastern European bloc, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, but we will also talk about the politics in the US and the upcoming European parliamentary elections. If you are new to the channel, please consider to subscribe and check our other English language content as well. Let's roll. So hello, Mr. Ivan Krastevvel, and thank you very much for accepting this interview.
Great pleasure.
You previously called the Polish elections the most decisive at the European level. And under the leadership of Donald Tusk, the Polish opposition was able to defeat the Law and Justice Party. And if we don't take into consideration the difference between the electoral system in Poland and in Hungary, what else was the most important factor which favorized the Polish opposition? What made the difference?
They're very different. Let's start from the fact why I do believe that they're extremely important elections. And this is the paradox of the year 2024. Year 2024, this time is kind of a long year. It started already with the Polish elections, and it is going to end in January 2025, when the new American president is going to come to office. And this is very important because in this 18 months, 16 months, 4 billion people in the world are going to vote. And some of these elections are going to be critically important. They're going to be as important in the way they're going to shape the world, in the way they're going to shape the wars which we're seeing around. You have going to have elections in Russia, which in certain ways is going to affect also Russian military strategies of what they're going to do or not to do. We don't know are there going to be elections in Ukraine or not. We're going to have a very important presidential elections in Taiwan, very nearby, which is going to be critically important, not simply for Taiwan, but also for the dynamics of the American-Chinese relations. You're going to have European elections, American elections, Mexico, India. So as a result of it, this is a world which is kind of in this 18 months, basically it's going to be totally kind of in a turmoil with a lot of changes. And the Polish elections were critically important because it is very clear that in the next 18 months also Europe is going to be shaped very much by what is going on. In a certain way, European elections, American elections, even much more than the European elections. And here was the Polish elections because as a result of the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, Eastern Europe has become much more important, but basically there was not a strong Eastern European voice which was constructive about how European future is going to look like. And here comes the difference. Listen, being Bulgarian, I always find it very funny when people who have been in the country twice were coming and telling me what is happening in Bulgaria. So from this point of view, don't expect, I don't know Hungary in the way any of your viewers know it. So this is, but there is certain things about Poland that in my view people kind of totally underestimated. Poland is a genuinely divided society. It's not simply that people are voting differently, but in a certain way you have two societies basically coexisting in a very kind of a confrontational situation. And this was the result of the fact that there was a certain soft conservative consensus in Poland in the 1990s that it was endorsed by all political parties in a way, both on the left and on the right. And this conservative consensus was also very much based on the fact that, unlike in Hungary, Catholic Church was a very important figure in Polish life and in Polish politics before 1989. Solidarity and the Catholic Church was what basically was at the core of the opposition, and because the opposition in Poland, unlike the opposition in Hungary and others, was a mass phenomenon. In 1980, 10 million people were members of Solidarity. So this was not an elite exercise. But of course, Solidarity consists of two totally different groups back then, and this is very important to keep it. There was a very strong sovereignist, nationalist and conservative part of Solidarity, and PiS and Mr. Kaczynski very much represent this group. For them, the West was the place where religion is respected, traditionalism was there. It was very much kind of West of the 1950s. And then when PiS came to power, they did two things, and one of them were very important. What people are not understanding, and here there is a certain differences with Hungary, because of the fact that Tusk government, and keep in mind, Poland is an economically extremely dynamic society. For all these years, in a certain way, Poland is the best performing European economy. Poland didn't have a recession even in 2009, 2010. It does not have these traumatic economic experiences of Hungary with the global financial crisis. This was a society that, nevertheless, that in the beginning, they have a very high unemployment rates and so on, but it was a highly, highly dynamic society. But then come peace, and peace did something which, in a certain way, was quite legitimate. There was a major redistribution of incomes. If you look at the economic policies, basically, PiS was the Poland Socialist Party. They very much focused on certain groups, particularly outside of the big cities, really trying to increase minimum salaries, very much increasing support for some of the less educated and less competitive groups, and this was popular. So when they was basically re-elected for the second time, their social agenda was critically important, and then basically the opposition didn't have kind of a classical political leader. But then the idea of pushing society much more in a classical conservative way, trying to remaking society, they were very pedagogical. And part of it was the result that, and for me this is very important, and this is when historians one day are going to look at this period, they're going to understand that Polish society was mostly, in social terms, liberalized during the Kaczynski period. And I'm going to give you a simple example. Listen, in 1990, there was an abortion compromise endorsed by everybody, including Tusk and this wing of Solidarity, which basically was kind of making abortion banned, but creating a lot of possibilities for people under certain conditions to go and to get this. So suddenly, basically, PiS decided to radicalize very much this, and you have a very strong women movement, particularly very young girls, schoolgirls, who go there. They were on the street. This was a mass protests. So suddenly social issues, but this time not social economic issues, but other social issues starts to be much more important than they used to be. Secondly, you have a lot of issues on which Polish society was very conservative, but at the same time, PiS decided to weaponize them. For example, the attack on gay marriages and others. And here's the interesting story. You have an older generation of Poles, above 60s. I don't believe, honestly speaking, that they changed their views on gay marriages. But this is the opposition voters. This was the Tusk voters. And for them, attacking gay marriages was not an option anymore, because for them, the major dividing line was peace. So they're never going to say anything that is going to make people believe that they're supporting peace. So suddenly, you have this transformation, which was based first on a generational change, but secondly, on the fact that certain groups, which were part of this conservative majority, stopped to be. These people suddenly said, I don't know what I think about gay marriages, but I'm strongly against the government to tell us how to live and what to think and what to do. And this is how basically you start having this transformation of the Polish society. And in the moment in which the church was so close to the government is also the years in which the decline of the church attendance among the young people was very high. The first major, of course, surprise was the electoral turnout. The electoral turnout was incredibly high, which means that 10% more people voted on these elections than in 1989. Suddenly, people decided how historical these elections are. Secondly, while the opposition was going with the three groups, they managed basically to coordinate their actions, and Donald Tusk managed to establish himself as the leader of the opposition. For Mr. Kaczynski, the whole historical fate of Poland was fighting on two fronts. You should fight Germany and Russia at the same time. You always believe that there is a kind of a conspiracy between the two. So during the elections, in a moment in which basically Poland is bordering a war, and people were very much aware of this, he decided to make war on Germany the major kind of a center of the campaign, and Tusk was, of course, very much faced as the German candidate. And to be honest, in politics, it's very important to keep proportion. The joke in Poland was, who can survive watching the the primetime news on the public television if he's going to drink 50 grams of vodka anytime that the name of Donald Tusk is going to be mentioned in a negative context. This is why the young people, nobody expected young people to vote in such high numbers of what happened.
But what went wrong with the referendum strategy in Poland? Because in Fidesz's case, during the last year, they were able to mobilize their voters with the referendum as well. I wouldn't say that it had a decisive importance in the victory of Fidesz, but it had an importance. So what went wrong with the same strategy in Poland?
When you're asking me about Hungary and Poland, and the differences are different. You have a constitutional majority in 2010, which allowed certain things to happen, and it's not happening in Poland. But in Poland, you have the idea of a collective success economically. Poles are not pessimistic about their lives, if you go on the opinion polls. They have never been. And secondly, Poland is doing fine. I was, before the elections in Poland, and I saw a taxi driver. And he was a guy who probably didn't vote, or probably at the end voted for Tusk. But he said, listen, the funny story is everybody is saying how divided the country is, but nevertheless, who is in power, I'm doing better and better. There are not many countries in which you're going to hear this. So the idea of economic success. Secondly, you remember in 2015, 2016, like in Hungary, like in Bulgaria, Poland was extremely skeptical about any type of immigrants, and there was a very major mobilization. And of course, but then comes the war in Ukraine, and there were millions of Poles, of Ukrainians staying in Poland. There was 8% of the Polish families have been having an Ukrainian refugee in their own houses. And most of these people were basically supported by civil society, but also Kaczynski government was doing this and that. So from this point of view also, the war experience was very different. Suddenly, this idea that what is happening now matters is important. And here comes the younger generation, which is, and this is an important element. Many people who are critical of Tusk being the leader of the opposition, he said, listen, the young people are pissed off. For all this year, it's Tusk versus Kaczynski. It goes for 15 years. And even some of my friends, younger friends, are saying, listen, it cannot go like this. I don't remember anything but basically Tusk versus Kaczynski. But here, first of all, and this is talking about political leadership, Donald Tusk managed first to change himself. He was as determined as Kaczynski was. And this is not by accident. You have the representative of two of the representatives of the heroic generation of solidarity. And they were not fighting simply of who is going to win the elections. They're going to fight also who is going to get the solidarity legacy, who is going to shape the past. And this is critically important. It was not simply about the future. It was about to whom solidarity belongs. So this is what happened in Poland, and of course it's very Polish. The fact that it happened in Poland does not mean that it is going to happen everywhere, but it is also showing to what extent first political leadership matters, but also how society has changed. Also demographically, people who voted in 1989 are not the same who voted today. A totally new generation came. And also Poland, from this point of view, is much more exposed to the world outside. They have been working abroad, coming back. This was a society which a lot of part of the population has been traveling in different directions. And I do believe this kind of understanding and knowing Europe, if you go on the opinion polls, by the way, Poles are very pro-European. They have the idea that nobody can win elections in Poland on the platform that they want to leave the European Union.
Next year there will be European parliamentary elections, but it also marks the 20th anniversary of the first wave of EU enlargement towards Eastern European countries. And obviously one of the most important promises of EU membership for Eastern European countries was economic catch-up and prosperity. Looking back 20 years on, how do you see it fulfilling the hopes to those who entered?
Listen, you're never fulfilling the hopes of the people. Never reality can be better than the future that you have imagined. So from this point of view, you have countries like Poland and the Czech Republic who really managed to get standard of living and basically all social structure that is much closer to basically Western Europe, and they're doing particularly better than countries like Spain or Portugal on certain things. Yeah, of course, there is also countries, and Bulgaria and Romania being one of them, that are not overperforming. So if you're going to ask me, what is my predictions? I still don't have a predictions how these elections are going to look like, but I do believe that our societies are dramatically transforming. And one of the good things with the Polish elections is, don't forget, Donald Tusk is the East European politician who knows the European Union best. He was for 2 terms Prime Minister of Poland, and then he was for 2 terms the President of the European Council. As a result of it, basically, in my view, European Union, better than before, has a position, if it wants, to be part of a constructive conversations, because European Union is changing. And now when people are talking about enlargement, this is also a major remaking. To get countries like Ukraine in the Union, it means a different Union. Geopolitical situation has changed dramatically. Economic situation has changed dramatically because of deglobalization and so on. So probably we have a better position to be heard. But of course, European Union is, Eastern Europe is quite divided when it comes to this. And I'm not sure that, for example, Mr. Orbán is going to subscribe easily for the vision of Donald Tusk.
If you take a look on America, the so-called Inflation Reduction Plan already shows its positive impact on the economy. What do you think about the RFF money? So do you think it has the same positive impact on the European economy because it was designed to boost the economy after the pandemic? Does it show its positive effects?
No, at the moment America is growing much faster, and the employment in macroeconomic terms, basically Americans, but it's a different, also these are very different economies. The stories, and this is very important to understand also why people became very nervous about things which otherwise they should support when you're asking them on opinion polls, like basically investing in renewables and so on. The story is that before every crisis, the government's telling you there is no money. And then comes COVID, and the same government is telling money is not the problem. You're told there is no money, and then comes the war, and they're saying money is not the problem. And people said, what is going on? And I do believe that one of the reasons is of course, American government went much more aggressively, was basically going with the industrial policy because reindustrializing the United States was critical. In Europe, it was interesting because different countries have in a very different positions. Germany has a much higher level of industrial production than the United States. But on the other side, of course, Germany is very much threatened because the 3 major pillars on which the German model was based have been hit at one and the same moment, which means they have been totally dependent on the American security umbrella. And then came the Trump period, and basically they said, we cannot take it for granted anymore. All strategy of Germany for kind of a climate energy transition was based on the cheap Russian oil. And then the war came, and basically the Russian oil simply disappeared. And certainly Germany was very much dependent on its exports for China. Yeah. And then basically the relations between the West and China went into the directions that basically you can expect at any moment your companies to face tariffs or basically impossibility to work and to export where they have been exporting. So one of the interesting moments is that at this moment, if during the financial crisis in 2009-2010, Germany was kind of outside of the crisis. Everybody was in crisis, and kind of Germany was perceived as part of the solution. They didn't have a major economic crisis, they have the money and so on. Now Germany is at the center of the crisis for the 3 reasons that we are talking about. And this is making the situation differently, and this is why the reindustrialization in Europe goes on European level, but also on national level. Mm-hmm. And for example, now for them the biggest problem is, as you know, they have this almost 10 billion that they want to invest in Intel. In microchips being produced in Europe, and now they have the problem with the Constitutional Court, and so on. So this is a big issue. Some of the small countries, they can benefit and they can lose. They can benefit because now some of the industries are coming back to Europe, so-called onshoring. You want basically to have your production closer to you, because what we learned during the COVID is that we are totally dependent. For example, almost 164 major products, including some key medicines and others, 80% of the production of these products was in a single country. For example, Indonesia or India or this or that. If there is going to be a problem with this country, you're done. So now this is changing. There is also this idea that you want to put your production in a country which you believe that if there's going to be a geopolitical crisis, is going to stay on your side, so-called friendshoring. And here some of East European countries are not in a bad position because we still have certain advantages, but the problem is our labor market. Mm-hmm. We don't have people. And this is the biggest issue in a certain way. This is why, strangely enough, many of our countries strongly benefited from the refugee wave coming from Ukraine. Because these are people who immediately entered the job market, particularly in areas like health or education.
Let's turn to the war in Ukraine. In one of your recent articles, you wrote about that the Western public is getting tired of the war. Can you expand on this?
Listen, psychologically, this is very. The dynamics of the Ukrainian war is extremely interesting, and also, like every crisis, it divides Europe. When the war started, it was a major shock because some major assumptions on which European security were based suddenly collapsed overday. And for example, we were convinced that a major war is not possible in Europe anymore. Yeah, military conflicts, yeah, something that happened in 2014. But listen, what we are seeing in Ukraine now is a major war between two very big countries. And the number of shells, artillery shells, that are fired today is on the level of 1943. So we're talking about something enormous. This is a big war. And this basically shocked Europeans. We were sure that this cannot happen in Europe, not in the world. The second thing that shocked us is that, particularly after the American war in Iraq, we decided that military power doesn't buy you much. Okay, Americans were so powerful, so what did they achieve? So as a result of it, Europe basically fell in love with economic power, with soft power, and so on. But then when the war started, it turned out that Europe is totally unprepared. So in the moment the war started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks, Germany for 2 days. Now for 2 years, we cannot, on the industrial level, reach the level of production of ammunition. At the moment, the Russians are producing 3 times more, for example, artillery shells than the West. So this is not simply about soldiers, it's also industrial defense industries and so on. All this could turn to be absolutely incompatible. And the other shock was, which was kind of a less discussed about, is also Ukraine shows the strength of nationalism. You see basically people who are ready to die for their land. And our societies are post-heroic societies. We believe that the governments don't ask any more people, don't have the right anymore to ask people to die. And then you see this happening. So in the beginning, of course, there was a major divide between East and West. Countries like Poland, like the Baltic republics, for them what was happening in Ukraine was about them. And in the West, the fear was much more of a nuclear war. And this was the first 6 months. I'm saying this because we had been polling quite a lot. So this is what's coming from the data. And then come the miracle. When the war started, Europeans were sure that Russians are going to prevail. Because they were a big army, because they started it, because we have the idea of Ukraine totally dysfunctional. And then suddenly, starting with the spring of 2022, the successes of the Ukrainian armies started, and then you have the feeling that this cannot be stopped anymore. And this is how it works, because it was a kind of classical anti-colonial war. And this created, in my view, unrealistic expectations about what can happen. And to be absolutely honest, we also created slightly cartoonish view of the Russian army. And the story was that the Russian army technologically was much more incomparable to some of the Western armies, but it is a big army with a lot of people. It is a big country, and you have a leadership which is tolerating a lot of casualties. And as a result of it, we ended up with this stalemate that we have now. And suddenly Europeans get tired. And also, some of the economic costs come up. And it is difficult. In the beginning, there was a total solidarity. Majority of the people identified with people coming from Ukraine, because morally, this is not a difficult case. But then other conflicts coming. So now you have the Israeli-Palestinian stuff. You have this and that. And people stop being focused on this. And suddenly the idea, it's important for this to end. The problem is that now Europe is much more so shattered by what's happening in the American Congress, because even if Europeans are ready to mobilize the money, and as you know, with the exception of Hungary, basically countries agreed on this, but the biggest problem is that we cannot, in military terms, deliver to the Ukrainians what Americans can do. And in the case of the United States, it became very much domestic politics.
At the beginning of this year, Western media was very enthusiastic about the prospects of the Ukrainian counterattack. And let's say that these hopes were not proved by history. How do you see that there was any real chance for the Ukrainian advance? And if not, what went wrong?
Listen, I'm not a military expert. And to be honest, I'm always slightly skeptical when people like me who don't know much about military stuff suddenly start talking as if they have been generals in 2 wars. It's a great story. Listen, the support and the belief of the majority of Europeans, and this depends from country to country, that Ukraine can win was very much the result of the Ukrainian victories in the summer and autumn of 2022. What happened around Kharkiv, what happened around Kherson. And then basically the Ukrainian military leadership, rhetorically, in order to mobilize support, created this idea that we are going to finish in 6 months. For me, this was unrealistic for 3 very simple reasons. Even if Ukrainian army managed to regain all its territory, it does not mean the end of the war, because President Putin is not going simply to say, okay, you regain territories, and take it, and I'm going to stand there. So in a certain way, there is no any type of a victory scenario without change either of policy or change of leadership of Russia. And contrary to many people who basically, during the Prigozhin mutiny, saw the weakness of the Russian system, I saw the weakness of the system, but also the consolidation of the elite. In a certain way, basically, nobody joined him. And as a result of it, my idea was that obviously we're going for a long war. Also, people are not listening carefully what President Putin is saying. He's famous for one thing. He's not particularly trustful when he talks about the past, but he quite often says what he's going to do. And he basically, after the mobilization in September, totally changed his policies, because in order to understand what happened in Ukraine, in my view at least, kind of artificially, it makes sense to divide this war into 3 different wars. The first was the war that started with annexation of Crimea, and basically what happened in Donbass. This was the moment in which basically Ukrainian state was very weak. At some point there was no Ukrainian state after Yanukovych left the army totally demoralized and others, and it ended with the Minsk agreement, and Russia won. This was a kind of a war that was totally run on the Russian side by the intelligence services. And then comes the second war. So it was a special operation. It started on 24th of February. Their major idea was basically putting Ukraine under Russian control, at least Kiev, if not the western part of Ukraine. And it ended in September 2022 with the mobilization, and Ukraine won. The special operation finished. The special operation, like the first one, was run by much more the intelligence services than the army. And then comes the third war, which we have now. And this is very much a major war. It is run by the Russian army and the leadership of the Russian army, then basically the intelligence community in Moscow. And what is important is that President Putin basically redefined the objectives of this war. First, he said it's a proxy war against the West. Secondly, he promised Russians long or almost never-ending war. In his State of the Union, he said that every 6 months, soldiers are going to have the right to go back home for 2 weeks. Listen, this is not about victory. This is about the situation of a never-ending war, because this allows the regime to consolidate and to justify its policies. And secondly, if you're not fighting Ukraine, if you're fighting the West, what is the objective? And I don't believe that the objective is anymore the Russian control over Ukraine. This is also as unrealistic as, to be honest, Ukrainian idea that in 6 months they're going to liberate territories. It's very much making Ukraine a failed state. If you see during the special operation, Russians were much more careful when they were trying to destroy and bomb civil infrastructure, because they do believe that the pro-Russian government is going to be in Kiev and they needed it. Now they're totally trying to destroy the major pillars of the Ukrainian economy, basically the silos for grain around Odessa and so on, or Mykolaiv. Because for them, the story is that pro-Western Ukraine can be only a failed state. And his major story is Russia is more committed, the West at some point is going to be tired, the money is going to stop. And then basically Ukraine is going to be nothing. And I don't believe that Russia is really interested in rebuilding what they're controlling as a territories, because also part of the Donbass is totally depopulated. So from this point of view, this is a different war. And our European conversation is very much what Europe is doing. We don't see ourselves as in a war with Russia, but this is how the Russians see it. We have this opinion polling, which basically shows that everybody in Russia, but also in China, in Brazil, and India, see this as a proxy war. Mm-hmm. Only we believe that we are not in a war. And this is a luxury position, but it is very difficult to win the war in which you are not participating. So from this point of view, what to do with Ukraine in this situation, in my view, is important. And also for the Ukrainian leadership, it's quite often to stop simply saying, oh, we're going to have it counteroffensive is succeeding, we're going to do it, if not on Monday, on Thursday, but to try how to prevent Ukraine being a failed state. And it means first that you should try to come with a certain protected territory, and here I mean much more air defense, which is going to allow Ukraine to start to develop certain economy. Mm-hmm. Particularly defense industry. They should be able to produce some of their shells, some of their bullets.
Do you think that's feasible?
Listen, this is the problem of funding and the problem of technology that it gets. At the moment, Kiev is such a protected area. To be honest, Kiev is a safe city. I have been there in June. Basically, if you're not afraid of Syrians, the chance to be killed, it's not very high. The second thing, which is hugely important for Ukraine and people don't know how to talk about, is the exodus of people. At the moment, around 28 million people are living in Ukraine, almost 8-9 million people out. If they're going to be a long war, and if they're not going to have possibility for these people to have certain level of security and certain jobs, these people are not going to go back, because the kids go to school, you find your place, and if they're going to be even kind of armistice and not peace, keep in mind it's going to be that husbands are going to join wives and not wives going back to the husbands. Plus you have an increased number of divorces and so on. This is a major, by the way, the social trauma. And also in the Ukrainian societies, there are type of tensions that are unavoidable between those who went to the front and those who didn't, between those who were in the country and those who left. So in order to have a long-term strategy, you should be ready to address all these issues. Financially on the side of the West, but also for the Ukrainian leadership, how to keep the nation consolidated for a longer period of time. And I do believe this is a major challenge, and this is what we are facing now.
And coming to the last topic of our interview, let's talk about Hungary. Is it fair to say that a long time ago, you were acquaintances of each other with Mr. Orbán?
Yeah, I have met Mr. Orbán, yeah.
When was the last time you met with him?
It was more than 10, 12 years ago. I have met members of his government and so on. And listen, I want to be also very fair about this. Orbán is a very gifted politician, and anybody who is basically not going to recognize it is wrong. In a strange way, I do believe that he created a model that many successfully or unsuccessfully try to imitate. This model, in my view, is not easy to be imitated. There are certain things in the Hungarian reality that made it possible, but also he has such a high level of political risk-taking that basically can also destroy you. He took a very high risk supporting Trump in 2016 when most of the Republican governors didn't. He's taking a very high risk now because basically, obviously, of what I see, his strategy is totally based on re-elections of President Trump. Otherwise, he can get isolated in the European Union in the way that Hungary is going really to lose around it. Playing such a policy is not easy. But Europe is changing and the world is changing. Obviously, Mr. Orbán is betting on this. But the things that if I was Mr. Orbán, I was going to be worried about, honestly, is what I was seeing in Israel. I never believed that either Trump or Putin has been model for him. But I do believe that if there was a kind of a political model and political leader that totally fascinated not only Mr. Orbán, but primarily Mr. Orbán, it was Mr. Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. And in a certain way, Israel was the dream of nationalist conservative camp in Europe. You have a small country which is incredibly developed and particularly incredibly developed in technological terms. Secondly, you have a country which is small but nuclear and sovereign. So in a certain way, this is a country which manages to have a leverage over policy of bigger countries, be it United States, be it others. And thirdly, this is a democracy, but it's a very much ethnic democracy. This is a Jewish state in the way basically all of our leaders basically see our country as basically being owned. And I do believe what is happening with Netanyahu, and particularly after October 7th, shows also the risk of this moment. It shows first that political polarization is a national security risk. Nobody who is honest is going to explain the failure of the intelligence community and so on October 7 if he's not going to take into account that in the last year or the last 10 months, Israeli society was so divided because of the judicial reform, because of what's happening there, that in a certain way they stopped thinking in the way they have been thinking before. So dividing societies has a price. Yeah. And secondly, what has a price is that at some point, when the politics is totally focused on a single personality, then at some point this personality is going to be blamed for everything. And I'm very much interested, I'm not sure, I don't know, is Prime Minister Orbán ready to give you an interview? But if I was you, I was going to ask really to have conversations about what he personally is learning of what is happening. And in my view, the interesting story is if President Trump is going to be elected for the new term, this is going to be a major change for Europe. And then probably Mr. Orbán, his bet can go right, and I'm sure that his political influence in Europe is going to rise. If Mr. Trump is going to be defeated, I do believe that the Hungarian government is really going to face the need for general reconsidering of their strategy. And this is why, because it's going to have economic costs, and it has basically societal costs. So this is an incredible moment.
Mr. Krastevvel, thank you very much for your time and thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching this interview with Mr. Ivan Krastevvel. Please consider to subscribe to our channel, check our other English language content, and if you can, please join to our supporters via the link below the video. Bye.